Wars are hugely expensive. They often cost billions. With few exceptions, many countries usually come together to foot the bill. So now that the conflict in Gaza has taken centre stage, what will that mean for the war in Ukraine? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Western nations have given billions of dollars to Ukraine in financial, humanitarian and military assistance. As the world's focus is pulled further east to the conflict in Gaza, what impact will that have on Ukraine's ability to fight through another winter?
The list is long of all the countries the Ukrainian president needs to thank for continued financial and military support. These are the top 10 donor nations to Ukraine. Their total contribution is $235 billion. That's more than Greece's GDP, the value of everything the country produces in a year. The United States is by far the biggest individual nation to contribute. Even by American standards, it's significant. Ukraine receives more than the budget for the US Space Agency. Now, the attention of the US and other Western countries is being drawn to the Middle East, the war between Israel and Hamas, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. World leaders are making physical as well as financial shows of support. The EU is pledging millions, though not yet billions. No one knows better than President Volodymyr Zelensky what it takes to live and govern through a war.
This is not the time to isolate ourselves. This is not the time to remain silent or pretend that terror on one continent does not affect global affairs.
His European allies continue to signal support, but global priorities are shifting. Winter is coming in Ukraine, and the country is expecting renewed efforts by Russia to disrupt the power grids and other infrastructure to freeze out Ukrainians. For the country to make it to spring, Ukraine needs money and missiles to shoot down Russian artillery. Some experts are warning that stockpiles are running dangerously low. So can Ukraine endure months of subzero fighting while the world is distracted?
Well, let's meet our panel. In Alexandria, Virginia, in the US, is Joseph Dresen, Senior Program Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Centre's Kennan Institute. In Brighouse, in West Yorkshire, in the UK, is Dr. Martin Smith, Senior Lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And in Belgrade is Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a political risk consultancy. Joseph, to you first. What is your reading of the conflict between Israel and Hamas and its potential to knock on into what's been happening on Ukraine?
Well, it's already knocking on in the sense that it's knocking off the war in Ukraine from major headlines. And I think the government of Russian Federation loves that it is doing that. And I think President Putin is going to try as hard as he can to keep a false equivalence between what Israel is doing in defending itself from Hamas and what Ukraine is doing in defending itself from the Russian attack. We can look forward to, for example, Russia continuing to blame the United States for what is happening in Gaza. We can look forward to Russia continuing to create distractions and false equivalencies between the two campaigns. And for every new round of casualties in Gaza, I think Russia hopes that it will weaken support for Ukraine amongst the allies.
Martin, that's a very interesting point Joseph makes, isn't it? I mean, I can't remember the last evening I turned on the evening news and Ukraine was the lead story. It's all about Gaza, and rightly so. But is Putin an unwitting winner here?
I think there are a couple of risks. I think I would agree with what Joseph said, first of all. And in addition, I think that the Israel-Gaza conflict is now polarizing opinion, particularly within the United States, and therefore accentuating the cracks, the divisions that were already becoming apparent between those who favour continuing to support Ukraine and for as long as it takes and trying to meet Ukraine's request for additional military equipment and indeed new military supplies, the F-16 combat aircraft, for example, next spring. And those in the Republican Party in particular, who were already expressing doubts and scepticism about at least maintaining the level and degree and nature of support for Ukraine, they now have, if you like, an alternative focus to make the argument that the United States can't do everything. It shouldn't be doing everything. Israel is one of our principal partners and allies. And if we need to make a choice, then we should be definitely prioritizing the military and other support that we give to Israel. And I think in terms of the American political debate, we already see those battle lines being drawn. President Biden is attempting to head off the problem by presenting to Congress a bill to fund both Ukraine military equipment and support for both Ukraine and Israel. But already, now that they've recently elected a new speaker, Republicans in the House of Representatives have announced that they're going to try and split that bill off so that separate votes can be taken on the question of support for Israel and on the question of support for Ukraine. So I think that's the principal danger, is the extent to which American support for Ukraine going forward is now going to be called increasingly into question as a result of the new focus on supporting Israel.
Giorgio, is there a danger for Ukraine here that it simply gets forgotten about while the world watches on in horror, looking at what's happening in Gaza?
If I were in the Ukrainian government, my biggest concern would not be that the situation in Gaza, Israel, is going to result in the U.S. no longer sending arms to Ukraine or diverting them to Israel. My main concern would be about the issue that my two colleagues have raised, which is international, specifically Western and American attention shifting away from the conflict in Ukraine and shifting toward the Middle East. You know, the Biden administration has been very focused on great power competition in terms of confronting Russia, confronting China. There was all this talk about the U.S. leaving the Middle East. I think the U.S. was never going to leave the Middle East. But what we did see was the administration paying less attention to the Middle East compared to previous U.S. administrations. Well, I think we can forget about that now. I think probably throughout the remainder of Biden's first term, the situation in Israel-Palestine will probably dominate the foreign policy focus of policymakers in Washington. And that is certainly something that I think gives the leadership in Ukraine some very valid concerns right now.
Joseph, do you agree with that assessment?
I have good news for Ukraine. And the good news is that with Gaza in the headlines, the conversation in the country is turning towards providing support. And I think the Biden administration is going to succeed in bundling support for Ukraine and support for Israel in terms of the military aid package that the administration is trying to pass. I think if that package were to hit the House floor, it would pass with Republican votes and all Democratic votes. So it's not quite as dire yet. We do have a speaker who is not friendly to the idea of continuing support for Ukraine. I think it's for a variety of reasons. I think it politically advantages the Republicans to knock down every success that President Biden makes. But I think there's enough Republicans who believe in supporting our national interests to go forward with supporting Ukraine. And I would say that in terms of internationally, I think the risk that is not so much with Western allies, right, but with creating greater support in the global South for, or at least attracting it away from Ukraine, because they are tarring every Gazan casualty with the West, and the West is supporting Ukraine. I think that is the calculus that Moscow is making at this time.
Joseph, why did President Biden bundle the two countries together with that request to Congress? He's asking for, what, $106 billion, but it was all bundled together, Ukraine and Israel. Is that correct?
It's correct. And there are other issues included with that. I think there's some funding for security at the southern border of the United States that is popular with Republicans. There's also a small amount of funding for civilian support for Palestinians who are caught up in this conflict. So the reason they bundled it is, as we said, it's going to be more popular to pass. It's going to be harder for Republicans to vote against support for Israel. In fact, it's almost impossible for them to vote against support for Israel politically. That's why you bundle it with Ukraine aid. The both will pass together.
Martin, just give us a rough outline of what the differences are militarily between what Ukraine has been receiving and what the United States may be able to provide Israel.
I think probably the least of Ukraine's concerns is that it will end up, if you like, fishing from the same pool of military aid and equipment as Israel, because Ukraine's needs have been fairly consistent. It's for the basics, it's for artillery ammunition, it's for small arms ammunition, it's for armored capability, and it's for the prompt deployment as early as possible next year of the F-16 combat air capability. Israel is already pretty well equipped with all of those capabilities, as we're seeing in terms of both the aerial bombardment and the armored thrusts into the Gaza Strip at the moment. I think where there might be, the one area where there might be, if you like, direct competition in inverted commas between the two is with regard to air defense, because Israel's principal need is to buttress and further reinforce its Iron Dome, its air defense capability, against not only whatever Hamas has got left to throw at it from the Gaza Strip, but particularly against the possibility of Hezbollah joining the fray from Lebanon, with, by some accounts, up to 150,000 missiles in its armory. At the same time, and particularly now with the onset of winter, Ukraine has an increasing need for air defense to buttress its own and to further enhance its own air defense capabilities, in the expectation that Russia will try to do what it did this time last year and target its critical energy and other infrastructure. So I think in terms of specific military capabilities and supplies from the United States, the one to watch will be how American leaders decide and agree to supply components for air defense to both Ukraine and Israel, how that's divvied up, and whether a way can be found to ensure that both of those, with their own urgent requirements, are adequately supplied.
Giorgio, will the Biden administration, in your opinion, be able to support both wars and keep its focus?
To answer your question, yes, I do think the Biden administration will be able to do that. I think there are enough people on the Hill who would support that. I think there are voices in Washington who want to cut the aid for Ukraine, but I think at this point the U.S. is going to continue arming both Israel and Ukraine and giving high levels of support to both. Maybe something to consider, though, is if we have a change in the White House as a result of the election that's only about 12 months away, that raises some other questions. But I think as long as Biden is in the Oval Office, what I'm expecting is to see the U.S. continuing to focus on both of these conflicts.
Joseph, I want to talk to you about military capability. I mean, does your country have enough production capacity to keep pumping out support for two countries, two hugely significant conflicts? Is there a worry on that front?
Well, you just add capacity, right? If there's some demand for these armaments and supplies, I can't imagine why military contractors don't leap at the chance to expand their production capacity and meet that demand and make a lot of money in the process. It's something that mystified me during the Gulf War, how we failed to have adequate armored Humvees and the like against IEDs. When the traditional experience of wartime United States is we're able to meet the so-called arsenal of democracy. So I think that under the Biden administration, they will be able to meet the demands and balance it against our own security needs. But that is a very good question. It's something to be tested and to be proven in the months and perhaps the years to come.
And how do you think the ordinary American feels about constantly being asked to support other countries? I mean, when you speak to people at street level, do they feel they're constantly getting hit up for help?
So it's not so much a question of, we're giving help out. I mean, most of the money spent to defend Ukraine is spent on American jobs. It's one of the greatest jobs programs going in the United States currently. So I think it's more of a political football. It's more of almost a tribal element that if one side's for it, the other side has to be against it. But I think that there are enough people who put politics aside and realize that it really is in our national interest to stop Russia in Ukraine, because if Russia succeeds in capturing Ukraine, it won't stop in Ukraine. And the next time there's a confrontation between the West and Russia, it won't be just our armaments that are on the line. It'll perhaps be our soldiers as well. And it's not something that we care to contemplate.
Martin, European countries have always tended to follow America's lead on security issues. If the United States kind of changes tack and focuses more heavily on supporting Israel, for example, do you think that would have a very serious knock-on effect for Ukraine?
I think it would, and I think as well it would exacerbate tensions and create new divisions within NATO, because I think whereas the former Soviet, the Central East European members of NATO have been very, very committed and very much in the vanguard politically, militarily, and within their capabilities economically, very much in the vanguard of driving the alliance as a whole to maintain a high level of support to Ukraine overall. I think they would, for their own geostrategic and historical reasons, seek to continue doing that. But equally, sort of pulling in the other direction, is the way that NATO as a whole is accustomed to working, which is to follow an American lead, which doesn't mean simply doing whatever the United States at any given moment in time says, but it does mean that when the United States sets out a clear sense of policy focus and priority, that tends to percolate through to most other NATO members, and they tend to not necessarily slavishly follow suit, but recalibrate their focus accordingly. So I think there's a risk that NATO will be increasingly divided and therefore weakened overall in terms of its continued support for Ukraine, and that will further feed through potentially to reduce levels of support from within the European NATO member states as well. So I do think the European dimension to this is an important one, and is certainly one that we should be aware of going forward.
Giorgio, can any one country truly give its full attention to more than one major security issue at one time?
Well, of course, this type of energy is not limitless. While as I said earlier, I think the U.S. Is going to be able to continue arming Israel and Ukraine, and I'm not expecting the arms shipments to Ukraine to have to be diverted to Israel. But like I said earlier, I think what we're going to see is U.S. foreign policy become more focused in terms of sort of the discussions, the debates, the news coverage. There's going to be much more focus on Israel-Palestine, and that, I think, is definitely coming at the expense of the attention that people in Washington are paying to Ukraine. As you mentioned earlier, you haven't seen really so many headlines this month, or I guess I should say in October, haven't seen so many headlines about Ukraine, as the conflict in Ukraine seems to in many ways kind of reach a stalemate, I think it's not that it's going to be forgotten, but it's going to become a much lower priority for people to focus on and talk about.
Joseph, your country, as we all know, is facing up to a huge 2024, a presidential election. If Donald Trump were to get back into power, what do you think that would mean for A, the conflict in Ukraine, and B, if the situation in Gaza were still ongoing next year?
Well, I think that the United States, under President Trump, would probably pull most, if not all, the military support provided to Ukraine and a lot of the civilian funding as well. There would be a very strong question about how NATO continues and whether the United States would wish to continue to participate under President Trump. I think that the United States would continue to support Israel in its conflict with Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran. We'll back Israel to the hilt under any Republican or Democratic president. So, yeah, that would be a very different future than we're currently, would not be a continuation of current trend lines. Let's put it that way.
Martin, that's almost unthinkable, isn't it? NATO without the United States, Ukraine without American support.
I think NATO without the United States is by definition completely unthinkable. With all due respect to our friends in Canada, the United States is absolutely indispensable by definition to maintaining a North Atlantic treaty organization and a transatlantic security alliance. So in terms of the absolute imperative for President Zelensky in Ukraine, diplomatically, it seems to me, it is to do whatever they can to, under the current Biden presidency and whoever comes next, to prevent, Washington policymakers from facing any sort of binary choice, i.e. between maintaining significant support for Israel and maintaining significant support for Ukraine. Because I think, as Joseph has just indicated there, if it comes down to that kind of choice, then there's really only one winner, given the very, very entrenched and strong and durable support that exists for Israel across the bipartisan spectrum in Washington to a far greater extent than anything that exists for Ukraine.
Giorgio, we know President Zelensky of Ukraine is a fantastic communicator. He's someone who consistently lands his message very, very well. But in recent weeks, no matter what he says, it's just not making the headlines.
Yeah, and to that point, I think it's sort of interesting to see how Zelensky is addressing the situation in Israel-Palestine. He, is really going all out to express solidarity with Israel following the events of October 7th. And I think that's definitely part of an effort to maintain a lot of favor in the United States. Obviously, taking a very pro-Israel line is a strategy for always being on Washington's good side. I will note, though, that, I saw him speak virtually at the Doha Forum in March 2022, right after the full-scale invasion of his country. And then we all saw him speak in Saudi Arabia earlier this year. He has a message to Arab and Islamic countries about resisting occupation. I'll just say it's a little interesting that right now that language is not being used.
Joseph, do you ever pick up a sense of fatigue amongst the American population? All these overseas conflicts, people constantly asking for American military support, financial aid, humanitarian assistance. Is there a fatigue in the United States, do you feel now?
We are coming off of 2 decades of actual war where our soldiers were in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's a general sense of fatigue for conflict in general. I think in terms of supporting Ukraine, however, there's an understanding. It's a very morally clear case that Russia is the aggressor here, that Russia presents a threat to the world order, international rules-based law and order that the United States has benefited from leading for a number of decades. And that if a country like Russia can just take another country's territory by force, that has spill-on consequences to other countries by example. So China invading Taiwan, that's the just easiest and first thought that would occur to people. But any other country with an authoritarian government could then eye another neighbor's territory with greedy eyes and think that they might be able to get away with it. If the United States fails to stand up and counter and prevent Russia from taking Ukraine, if we continue to prevent Russia from doing so, it will continue to sustain the world order that we've all benefited from decades, since the Second World War's conclusion.
Martin, Giorgio and Joseph, thank you all for your input. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.